the time I was 10, I lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As I now am 21, I live in a bustling city in Alberta. I do find myself missing the settings from my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by this unsettling memory of what I am about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child and my father worked in another province months at a time. So I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forests. This night, I was exploring the woods. I usually never went too far in. Usually up to the large rock formation I like to climb and look up and out through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own little private place that I could just enjoy by myself. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I suddenly started hearing a sound from further in. A sound that wasn't natural at all. It was crying, faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared since crying was the last thing I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me. But it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to my house and calling my mother for help, but then I worried that the girl would have wandered further and beyond the earshot. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through these trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction that the crying was in. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to even make sure that I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all of this was how consistent this crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind, just non-stop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached this small clearing and had only a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A gray tape recorder, one of the biggest I had ever seen, was peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming from the speakers of it. This was really disturbing to me, as I had went all this way expecting to find a real person, but it was only a tape recorder. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside of the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady steps, advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying the rocks and trees that I always identified as a landmark. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't try to listen to see if there was anybody following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home and nothing else. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of my way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran into my house, locking the door, shutting off all the lights as I went to my room. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out of them discreetly, as I could see if anybody was possibly out there, if they had somehow managed to track me and keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by the window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge from the forest shadows. But nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mom about what happened that night. And I also never was able to go back into the forest again. I grew up in southern Ontario, and not having too many things to do in my hometown, I would often spend the weekends hiking out in the forest with my dad. To this day, I'm a great nature lover, and I think a lot of that comes from my experience out in the woods as a young boy. There's one memory, however, that stands out to me as a little eerie. On the weekends, my father would often take me on these drives out in the little country roads. We'd pull over at the sides if we saw like a farm or a river or anything else like that we just wanted to get out and investigate. On this day, I asked my dad if we could go through the forest that I saw on the side of the road, and he agreed. We walked into the forest for about 10 to 15 minutes before my dad stopped dead in his tracks. We saw a fairly new-looking bicycle, which had recently been chained up on a tree. There were no signs of rust on the chain or the bike. Next to the bike was an amateur path leading through the underbrush. Even to 7 or 8-year-old me, seeing this new bike so deep in these woods, which was on the side of a gravel road with no types of houses or anything near it, just seemed a little odd. Close by, we found apparently this full backpack, which had been left partially obscured by a bush. My dad was horrified by this bicycle for some reason. He whispered to me this elaborate story about how he thought the owner was a grow-op, drug activity, that they had left it there, and that they'd be liable to kill us if they found us. It was honestly shocking of how terrified my dad was. He was a man of strong constitution that didn't spook easily, and seeing him in such a state really unsettled me. Although this bike was out of place, there wasn't really anything frightening about it. And even at the time, I thought the grow-up conclusion was a bit of a jump. I still can't figure out what scared my dad by it. Shortly before he died, I brought this story back up to him, and he insisted that he had sensed danger, an especially odd comment coming from him. My father being a great skeptic and an atheist who delighted on tearing down any belief which was vaguely unscientific. He couldn't explain it to me when I pressed him further about it, insisting over and over again that he just sensed danger, which becomes even more eerie in context to the rest of my story. We headed back out the forest at a brisk pace. The forest floor was covered in autumn leaves. Funny how vividly I can remember this too. The look of the forest, how it was a bit muddy, the shade of orange of the leaves. He kept on whispering frustratedly at me to walk more quietly, which I can remember stressing out a lot about, worried that I'd make too much noise and we'd be caught. We were at a relatively short distance in this forest, so I'm not quite sure how we managed to somehow end up going down the wrong path, which only made my dad more tense. As we tried to make our way back to the car, I spotted something which made me feel deeply uneasy. It was like I could recognize the constitution parts of what I was seeing. But together it just made no sense. I can't remember the exact order of events, but I'm fairly sure that my dad didn't see it until I pointed it out to him. I'll never forget the look on his face. In the middle of the forest was a tree covered in about 20 or so winter coats, each hanging at the end of the branches, like executed criminals. Most of the coats were brightly colored with pattern designs that looked like they were from the 90s or early 2000s, made from that nasty plastic fabric. They were the kind of tacky numbers which used to populate the racks of thrift shops and wardrobes of Mary-Kate and Ashley or some shit. Most of them were in good enough condition to be a few years old at most, if not new. The coats were torn up as if somebody had a knife to them. I can clearly remember seeing brown stains bordering the perimeter of the torn sections, which at the time reminded me of dried applesauce, but through the years of half forgetting and embellishing, has come to resemble dried blood. It could have been anything for all I know, and remember, my dad seemed pretty upset when I reminded him about it years later. Some of the coats were adult-sized, and some seemed like they were children's. My dad turned to me and quickly told me to run. We eventually found the car, taking what seemed like a terribly long time to find our way back there. In the failing afternoon light, we drove home silently, contemplating what we saw. I was told never to tell my mother, and to this day I still haven't. At the time he told me he was going to tell the police, but when I asked him about it a few years ago, he seemed uncomfortable talking about it, so I dropped it. I still don't know what we saw, and I couldn't even give any real location of the forest. I grew up in Oxford County. It's likely it happened somewhere in there, or one of the surrounding counties. If I ever figured out where it was, I'd love to go back and have a second look. I dream about the forest once a month. A few years back, I decided to take my family, as in my wife and kids, out to a cabin deep in the woods, just for a weekend. Everything at first was all hunky-dory. We were having a good time, but then we started noticing things. We thought we saw people that were out in the woods, just watching. When we would turn around, they were just gone. The first day and night all went perfectly fine. I got a good night's sleep and we got up early in the morning. We went out, went for a hike, did a lot of different things together. But that night, something crazy happened. My wife was shaking me quietly. I looked around the cabin. The girls must have gone to bed. The fire had burned down to embers. My glass of scotch was still in my hand because I fell asleep on the couch. Something is tapping on the porch, honey. Then I heard it too. I grabbed my axe and lit my lantern, and I opened the door, expecting like a raccoon or a skunk or something. But instead I found this boy. He had to be at least 10 years old. He just stared at me petrified for a moment, then bolted down the path through the woods. I gave chase for just a few meters, but he was losing me. I heard him tumble to the ground, and I leaped on top of him in rage. "Why were you knocking on my porch?" I screamed at him. What he responded with gives me chills to this day. "My uncle told me to." He stammered. I was no longer angry, but just confused. But why? I asked him to get you out of your cabin. I immediately ran back and left him where he was, grabbed my children and my wife, and we immediately hopped in the truck and left. We came back the next day just to grab our luggage, and we came with the police. What we found horrifies us. Everything was gone. The glass was broken out of the window, and there was something carved on the side of the house. See you next time. It's safe to say that we never went back. And my God, I'm glad that I was able to get out of there and get my children and my wife back to safety. I don't know if I could have lived with what I was ready to do. But thank God it didn't come to that. Hello everyone. I just wanted to apologize once again for the late upload. I made sure to post in the community chat so you guys would know what was going on and why it has been a few days. It's starting to actually finally come back, and I'm just having problems with one of my eyes now. So hopefully that'll stop very soon. There's going to be more uploads and more videos. I'm going to try to get some more done for you, so you guys will have something new to watch. So thanks for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you like these type of stories, make sure to let me know down in the comment section. Make sure to like, comment, and if you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe. We're doing nothing but growing. Make sure to also check the links in the description as well. My Twitter, Instagram, and my Gmail if you want to submit a story are in there. But with that being said, stay safe, stay scary, and I'll see you in the next one. Hopefully it'll be when I'm supposed to upload next. But okay, bye.